So last week we discussed differences between lease agreements in the student accommodation space and in the buy-to-let space or the multi-let space. Now, what are the factors in student leases that are different, things that you need to look out for? Now, obviously here we need to apply our intuition. You're entering into contracts with students, most of the time with the students directly. So aside from those few examples where you might have a contract with the university that places students on their, under their control, and they take care of everything on behalf of those students, and you simply let it out to the universities. Under most circumstances, you would be entering into lease agreements with the students directly. Now, as explained in the previous video, there are few differences between the types of leases, but there are some subtle differences. For starters, please remember that you're entering into a lease agreement with a student. All right, and again, let's apply a level of intuition. A student does not have a job. More often than not, either a student has some sort of funding, like NSFAS funding as an example, or has obtained private debt through one of the banks under student loans, or is being funded by his or her parents. And those are most typically the examples of students that one will find. So finding a student that has worked, saved up money, joined varsity, and is now studying full-time and is willing to stay under student accommodation is unlikely. So it might happen, but you're looking at an exception rather than the rule. So if one applies to intuition, and we know that we're dealing with a party to a contract that cannot afford to pay the rent on his own without the help of somebody else and without it being subsidized by some kind of part-time job, you need to be mindful of the type of person that you're interacting with. And unfortunately, it is a person that doesn't have sufficient money. It is a person that hasn't been in the working world all that long. And unfortunately, students, because of the age component, and again, this doesn't apply to everyone, so I don't want to insult people in their youth, but the problem is the age component does play a role when it comes to taking care of a property that is not yours. Let's be fair, it comes with experience that over a period of time, people start becoming wiser as to the costs associated with lack of maintenance and repair of a property, and they start becoming more conservative on how to deal with that. The less that you own, the more likely it is that you're going to take advantage of it and not take care of it as well as you should. And as a student, unfortunately, there are many, many examples of students wanting to enjoy themselves at varsity, go out, have friends over, and really throw caution to the wind. Maybe they've just left home, whatever the case is. You as a landlord need to be mindful that there is a component and level of risk associated with student accommodation when it comes to this. So how do we mitigate that risk when it comes to students? And that's where more often than not, you can start looking at the parents. Now, just so you understand, it really depends now on who is funding the rental. But we often advise that people go to the parents in any event, just to make sure that there's a suretyship signed over any potential damage, especially the damage to the property. So even if the student's being funded by NSFAS or as a loan from one of the private banks, we would still suggest that because you're entering into the agreement with the student directly, that you at least get the parents' buy-in, that if anything were to go wrong, that the parents are able to actually pay you for any damage to the property. And remember, with NSFAS, for example, so NSFAS, for those that don't know, many students can apply to NSFAS and they get granting or loans from NSFAS that cover certain allowances, including accommodation and certain living expenses. So it's something that students in South Africa get awarded that allow them to study and progress and obviously have a tertiary education. So students can rely on this sort of funding in order to be able to get accommodation, and NSFAS has a particular rate that it pays to its landlords, and landlords typically have to be accredited in order to qualify for payment by NSFAS. So it's a great model. Unfortunately, there have been issues as of late when NSFAS hasn't paid. But unfortunately, that's a different conversation. And when we speak about due diligence, we can consider whether going to student accommodation using the NSFAS model or the private model works for you or not. But assuming for a second that NSFAS is happy to pay, and NSFAS will pay you, the landlord, directly, and you've got fixed income coming in, you still need to bear in mind that there could be damage to the property, so you'd want to be able to tie in the parent. You also need to bear in mind that there has been withdrawals of NSFAS funding in particular circumstances where the student has done something. So you also want to make sure to mitigate that, to ensure that if for some reason the student's funding stops and the student has to leave varsity or leaves the accommodation, that you actually have the parents' buy-in, and you have recourse from the parents for months now that you can't rent the unit out, for damage to the unit, that sort of thing. So suretyships are a big one in the student accommodation space. And another difference that's very, very important is the length of the lease. Now, students don't study 12 months of the year. Normally, varsity starts somewhere towards the end of January and ends towards the beginning of December. So accommodation during these periods, especially on a NSFAS model, isn't deemed required, meaning that landlords are left with 2 months of the year where there's absolutely no one staying on the premises. Now, this is something to factor in, and a lot of people do factor this in by knowing that they need to acquire sufficient cash flow to cover for those 2 months. And when you're looking at the financials, again, another due diligence question, it's easy to look at the financials and factor this in, because it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. It's just a question of 10 to 11 months of the year you get income, the other month you don't. Is it enough income to sustain your expenses over the full year, yes or no? So that's a financial conversation, but you need to factor this in the lease agreement itself, because if you're being funded by NSFAS, you need to accept that that is going to happen, and you might need to do something with the property over the period of time. I even know people, Nick and I were having a conversation over people that Airbnb it out. If you're in private student accommodation where you're privately renting to students who are paying it themselves without making use of NSFAS, then you can already start negotiating for a 12-month lease. And many students would take it. Why? Because they know that they're going to be staying there the following year. So they wouldn't want to have to move things out and then have to return and move things back in. So they would rather keep the premises for a full 12 months, fully secured. It belongs to them, no issue at all. So your private leasing may afford you the opportunity of having a 12-month lease. But leases that are funded, is especially by organizations like NSFAS, please remember, when you're doing the calculations and when you're drafting the leases, have that understanding that it's a 10 to 11-month lease. Depending on which university you're servicing, you would know what the terms are, and ensure that your lease agreement is appropriately drafted for that purpose.